We've had several airlines, particularly from Europe, cancelling flights to South Africa. Just how badly will the second wave affect South Africa and the industry in particular?
Well, I mean, most of the local airlines were flying local and domestic and kind of regional flights. So I think the big loser here is going to be AXA and the other support agencies involved in aviation, as well as tourism and the other sectors. So aviation here has been really in the doldrums since March, since the shutdown, with worsened by the fact that people like Comair have suffered from business rescue as well as South African Airways. So I think that overall, what it is, it's really led to speculation about the new year. A lot of the airlines had been targeting this end of the year growth, hopefully that COVID would be starting to dry up. But in our risk analysis that we've been doing since April, the opposite had been kind of a factor, and IATA was warning and had been warning that aviation was impacted. So I think what you can say is that we are in a severely restricted environment, and things just suddenly got a lot worse for some of the international operators, not just South African Airlines.
Guy, perhaps let me bring you in here now. I mean, already we know that just coming out of hard lockdown, that this industry was really, really battered. I mean, a few months ago, it was predicted that the South African aviation is set to lose 55 billion rands in 2020. Is that number likely to rise, given that we are now in the second wave and there's now this new variant of COVID-19?
Yeah, hi, Unathi, and nice to be with you. Indeed, the second wave is worse than we feared. It's impacting foreign tourism in particular. I think many of the foreign tourism operators, particularly in the tourist industry, the hotels, the bed and breakfasts, and so on, were beginning to see or hoping to see a return of international tourists for the festive season this year. That's now not really happening at all. Yeah, a couple have made it through, but now we've seen this resurgence, the second wave, hit the UK, and the same virus, 501 version 2, I believe, has been identified in South Africa. So it's already 7 or 8 countries have closed off their borders to South African tourists, and that will mean that there'll be a similar impact on tourists from that country. The first was Germany in coming to South Africa. So all in all, it means it's a very bad festive season because of the second wave of coronavirus for the South African tourism industry.
Now, Guy, just to keep you on there, you've commented recently that the impact of travel bans on South Africa will impact the aviation industry, but specifically the airline industry in a number of ways. Talk to us about the dynamics behind the scenes in terms of when one country decides to shut its borders or decides that, you know, no flights will be going to a particular country, what that means in terms of from the receiving end, you know, in an example, Germany cancelling flights to South Africa, obviously meaning that South Africans can't fly to that country, and some of the trade-offs that happen between countries.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that a flight requires an origin and a destination at both ends. So in other words, during the lockdown, we saw so-called repatriation flights, which had essentially what is called a dead leg, where the aircraft flew empty to perhaps go and fetch people to bring them back. That can't happen under normal commercial circumstances. You've got to have the aircraft filled both ways. So if Germany, for example, and there are many other countries now, Switzerland, Saudi Arabia, many others have followed suit, close off their boundaries to borders to South African travelers, then it means there won't be any travelers coming from South Africa to those countries, which means the airlines simply won't fly, even if there is demand in South Africa for tourists from those countries. It means that those tourists are not going to be able to get here, even if South African borders remain open to those tourists. That's what I mean by the elaborate two-step dance required at both ends of the route to make it work. And it's taken IATA and ICAO an enormous amount of effort to institute guidelines that the airports will be able to create and enact and enforce to enable traffic to flow both ways. With the emergence of the second wave, those guidelines are out the window, and we're hearing talk of quarantines coming into effect. And we know well that quarantines absolutely kill off international travel. very few people at all are prepared to travel internationally if they face even a 7-day quarantine lockdown period at the other end. So all in all, a very bad news for South African tourists and for the aviation industry, both particularly globally. We've seen a revision downwards of the, a revision upwards of the losses expected for 2020 and even for now for 2021, and a delay in the recovery to at least the second half of next year. It's very bad news indeed, and people will continue to really struggle and lose their jobs in this industry.
Desmond, you mentioned that several stakeholders in the value chain of this industry will be affected. You particularly mentioned AXA, and we know that for the first time in the history of its existence, I think, they asked for a bailout. What likely is the impact we are likely to see for AXA, Airports Company South Africa, during the second wave?
Well, I mean, already in the financial results, they had indicated that they're going to move away from aviation as the main revenue earner, which is amazing because they're called Airports Company of South Africa. So to take aviation out as the main earner is kind of, it was kind of interesting to hear that as a strategic future when it comes to access. So their risk and outlook analysis is showing that they need to make more money out of things that is not involving flying, which is really just an amazing statement for them to make. So they're selling off, for example, the international some of the capex that they own parts in airports in Brazil and I think India, and they're selling those. They're bringing some cash back in dollar terms, so that'll ease them a little. They're also going to be looking at their franchises. I mean, they're suffering because they offer franchises at the airports. Each one of these little retailers that operates at Latham and the other airports that you've seen, they have the rights to operate there and they pay rent to AXA, and they also pay the rights. And these people are earning nothing. So you can see that there's a knock-on effect here. But I must mention something else that is really huge and is starting to show up in African aviation in particular. You know, there's around 7.5 to 7.7 million people hired directly and indirectly by aviation in Africa. And the latest numbers we're getting from IATA is that close to 4.5 million of those are going to lose their jobs. So we're looking at over 50% of people involved in aviation in Africa generally are going to lose their jobs or have already lost their jobs, a large proportion of that. So you can see that we're looking at a substantial knock-on effect that's going to affect GDP, it's going to affect rates, it's going to affect our lives going forward. There's this bit of this myth that's been perpetuated that only the elite fly. That was true up to about 15 years ago, but low-cost airlines changed that. Commerce is really important. If you're going to make a sale, if ShopRite Checkers wants to start an entity in Sudan, they want to fly there and shake hands with people, the salespeople. They don't just want to do a Zoom call or a Teams call. So it will continue. There will be some recovery from this, but we're looking at a significant effect on people's lives, and we're talking about millions of Africans' lives because aviation has been so hammered by the COVID pandemic.
Now, a guy listening to Desmond, he does really paint a very gloomy picture for the sector. I mean, in the hard lockdown, there were questions about this sector surviving and how well it will survive. And just when we saw a little bit of a trajectory, we have now a second wave amongst us, and not only in South Africa, but across the continent, across the globe. Will this industry survive this second time around?
Well, it's going to survive, but the new normal is going to be considerably different to the old normal. The industry will take many years to rebuild the capacity. Current estimates are that the industry is going to shrink to the size it was in 2003. So we can see that how much growth will have been lost out of the industry. Yeah, obviously people will find themselves, the Americans like to use the word furloughed, which means unemployed for some sort of unknown period of time. And then as the industry starts to recover in about 2 or 3 years' time, then gradually the people will move back into the industry. Obviously, too, many people are just surviving. They're kind of what I would call the walking wounded. They might not have been killed by the industry yet, but they're surviving on tiny bits of income. Fortunately, in South Africa, though, international tourism may have been killed off now, but domestic tourism has held up pretty strongly. And I was speaking to Fly South Air yesterday, and they were confirming that their loads had been in the region of 5%, in other words, 5% more than they had been compared to last year. That's dropped off a bit with the return to flying of Comair Kalula, the British Airways, and also the new arrival Lift has dropped their previous loads down to 85% of what they were. But that is still sustainable for the local market. As Desmond said, we've also got to look at the regional market. That is also being affected by the international travel bans, but not quite as bad. But yet we're seeing the adept airlines, the flexible, responsive airlines moving into other markets, particularly Airlink, for instance, has started flying between Johannesburg and Cape Town, even though it doesn't really have the right gauge of aircraft to do that. But it's able to take advantage of the shift in demand, the new market demands, and operate its own aircraft, I believe, successfully on these otherwise extremely dense and high demand routes. So the good companies are flexible and they're adapting to accommodate this. However, the long-term damage to the tourism industry will take many more years to recover.
Desmond, perhaps as a final question, I mean, the passenger side of things, we are seeing a gloomier picture, internationally, but as Guy says, domestically, it's not looking as bad. But talking about air cargo now, I mean, it is expected to continue showcasing resilience. Very quickly, why is that so?
Well, I mean, a lot of the goods that are traveling around the world keep traveling around the world. And secondly, the COVID virus itself has entailed people need to move PPE, for example, the personal protective equipment around quite rapidly, and we've had shortages. So the virus itself has been a boon. And thirdly, that many of the operations, such as, for example, Ethiopian Airlines, and even SAA before it was closed down, we're looking at some of the cargo elements as a revenue earner in the future. People are buying online in higher numbers and more than ever before. So you need to move those goods around the world. Most of them, yes, are traveling by ship. But some of the other goods, the high-tech stuff, is moving by plane, and suddenly you have the situation where you and I click a button and buy something online, and then it travels by plane and by vehicle to get to your front door. So there are changes now, fundamental changes in our economy that's taking place under duress, but also involving innovation. So we're going to see that in the future, aviation will be slimmer and trimmer. Newer planes will fly, which are 15-20% cheaper to fly than the older planes. We're seeing a whole bunch of changes here that the lithe entrepreneur will drive.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. That was aviation experts Desmond, Latham and Guy Leitch.